Okay, guys. I apologize for the technical difficulties to get us started, but we are now going to welcome everyone to day 2 of webinar week. First, I hope everyone that participated yesterday certainly enjoyed the webinar that was presented by Carol Davis Smith. If you happen to miss the live webinar, it was recorded. You can find it online at webinarweek.live. Also yesterday, we released 9 new on-demand webinars. They will be available all week, and you can find them online again at webinarweek.live. And don't forget, if you participate in all 4 live webinars this week, you're entered into the grand prize drawing. One lucky attendee will win an all-expense paid trip to the MD Expo in Tampa this November 8th and 9th. That show is going to be at the Tampa Marriott Water Street. You can learn more about this conference by visiting mdexposhow.com. Today we have an exciting panel discussion titled Straight Talk on COVID-19's Effect on the HTM Industry. But before I introduce the panel, I want to remind everyone that the first of our 3 HTM mixers will take place next month, August 19th and 20th at the Omni Interlaken Hotel in Denver. These mixers will provide a slightly modified, less crowded, and safer environment, but is still the same caliber of networking and continuing education and vendor engagement that you've come to expect from the MD Expo. We are sharing the pre-show planner today. It's in the handout section of your webinar dashboard. You can download it there, or you can find it and additional information at htmmixer.com. We want to extend a big thank you to our sponsor today, Multi-Medical Systems. We're joined by Mike McRoberts, Senior Vice President of Business Development for Multi-Medical Systems, and Sherelle Sandrini, Director of Surgical Services and Biomedical Solutions from Multi-Medical Systems. They're going to say a couple of words before I introduce today's panel. So Mike, the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I want to first thank MD Publishing for giving us the opportunity to sponsor this webinar, and also, really coming up with creative solutions to keep us all connected and educated through these challenging times. Multi-Medical Systems, we were established in 1996, based out of the Central Valley of California. It was a small family-owned operation. For many years, probably about 6 years ago, we started to expand nationally, providing several programs that I believe that will assist all of you with your equipment maintenance and more. I'll first start out with our field service organization. We have a very robust field service organization located throughout California and also Washington State. We have 40 plus technicians that travel the roads every day, working on general medical devices, as well as some specialty devices like ventilators, anesthesia, or tables or lights. Kind of varies by the area and by the need of our current clientele. We also have several programs that we offer nationally for all of you. We have our on-demand Bmet support program, and basically what that is a temp placement solution. And this might be where you need to get caught up on PMs. You have new equipment coming into the facility, and you need additional resources to provide the maintenance on those devices. The term or the length of the program can last anywhere from 1 week, and we have several where we have technicians in the facility annually. So it really depends on what your needs are. It really goes from Bmet 1 up to a Bmet 4. We have placed managers in smaller locations around the country, more your critical access hospitals. But again, it's to support the need of additional support, additional employees as we go through these times. We also have a fusion pump project team or solution. This is a program where we have teams based throughout the country. Typically a team of 2 will come in and support the need of your preventive maintenance on your infusion devices. We can typically PM typically about 125 devices on a daily basis. The nice thing about this program is it is charged per device in most situations. And I say most situations right now, we have a pretty major large recall on one of the devices. So, depending on the need there, we might have to structure the pricing a little bit differently. But most of the time, we're able to price it per device, and it's our responsibility to perform the maintenance on your devices. Soup to nuts, we clean them, we pick them up, we PM them, battery replacements, and redistribute them to the floor. For two other of our solutions, I'm going to turn it over to Sherelle Sandrini, and she'll talk about our surgical device solution as well as equipment sales. Sherelle?
Good morning, everyone. I apologize for no video. I'm on the Oregon coast in our motorhome and just having a few technical difficulties, but I'm excited to be on and joining you all. As Mike let you know that I am the Director of Surgical Services, and that is a national offering. I wanted to share with you, as you guys are starting to exercise more of your ability to repair your own equipment through a third-party vendor, your right to repair, that Multi-Medical Systems is a great solution if you want to look at the alternative to save cost and increase your uptimes while decreasing your cost. We're there for you. We are working with new health systems right now that are finding our PM process to be different than others, and our turnaround times are quick, and our communication is exemplary as far as what's going on with your equipment at all times. You know when it's received, when you're returning it, how long the repair is going to be, where your loaner's at, and even when it arrives at your shipping dock. So we want to be very transparent in your cost and help you save costs by going through your equipment to make sure you're utilizing all of your fleet of endoscopes. Or could we trade some in to get you better usage out of the scopes that you actually need versus the ones you have? And also doing preventative maintenance. Along those lines, we also sell a lot of endoscopy equipment, from flexible to rigid endoscopes, instrumentation. We repair and sell all power instrumentation, camera couplers. Then we also, on the medical side of equipment, we also can offer you cost-saving solutions on purchasing anything from an infusion pump, beds, ventilators, anesthesia, anything you might need to pick up that you might need to just add to your equipment inventory to get you by until you're able to buy the new equipment that's coming out. But just know that Multi-Medical Systems is here to partner with you and help produce a cost savings and also produce a relationship that builds trust and understanding of what your needs are. We'll let you fit your program, and we will make our program fit you. So that's all we have to say here on Multi-Medical Systems. Back to you guys at MD Publishing.
I appreciate that so much, Mike and Cheryl. Thank you for taking some time, and thank you for sponsoring today's great panel discussion. I hope all the attendees will visit your website to learn more about your products and services. Guys, you can find their website by going to multimedicalsystems.com. Okay, as I mentioned previously, today's panel discussion is titled Straight Talk on COVID-19's Effect on the HTM Industry. Our panel includes Jennifer DeFrancisco, System Director of Clinical Engineering at University of Cincinnati Health, Michael Hauser, Clinical Engineering Manager at Middlesex Health, Mike Busticker, System Director of Clinical Engineering at Intermountain Continuum of Care, and Chris Nowak, Senior Director of Healthcare Technology Management at UHS of Delaware. Chris is also serving as our moderator today. Before I turn it over to him, I want to remind all of the attendees, we welcome your questions throughout the presentation. Please chat them to us or use the question feature on your dashboard. We'll try to get through as many as time will allow. But Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you. You may begin whenever you're ready.
Great, Jamie. Thank you very much. And again, I want to offer on behalf of all the attendees and my esteemed peers that have joined me today on this webinar. I want to offer my thanks to MD Publishing and all of the team at MD Publishing who really support our industry, the healthcare technology management industry, and what you deliver to help us be better to deliver great care to the patients that we serve. And of course, multi-medical systems, none of this can be made possible without the assistance with vendors like multi-medical systems. So thank you, Mike, and your team. So today's conversation with my peers is about the wonderful pandemic that we've all been subject to over the several last months. And I hope that the attendees, you out there in webinar land, have a takeaway of a couple of nuggets of operational efficiencies or excellence that you might be able to adapt into your program and help your patients through this pandemic. I'm sure we've all been touched through this pandemic either through the volume of patients that we're seeing, or even just operationally with our staffing and things like that. So I'm going to ask Jenna, throw the first question out there, and I invite Mike and Michael to join in after Jenna puts out her perspective. But with regard to the COVID, how has infection impacted your staffing levels? Have you had troubles within your facilities with staffing? Do you feel as though the staffing level didn't keep up with the amount of maintenance required from a regulatory perspective, especially prior to the CMS?
So one of the things that we were requested to do was to provide a furlough of about 20% of our staff. With that, we really quickly saw that we didn't have a decrease in workload consummate to that. So we had to go back to the drawing board and see how to really address that. One of the ways that we addressed that early in the pandemic was to split our team into 2 teams. So we actually had staff on our on-site 19 to 20 hours a day, with on-call only covering a few hours. With that, we were able to keep up with PMs and all of those great things. And we still are doing furloughs. And honestly, we actually have a workload that's a bit higher than it was prior to the pandemic, with the additional cleaning and breakages and things like that. Another thing that I found really helpful, specifically at the beginning of the pandemic, was kind of a quick psychological check on all of my direct reports, and I had them do it with theirs. I said, hey, let's take a look. Are you in fight, flight, or freeze? So, there's a lot of people in fight mode. There's a lot of people in freeze mode. There's a lot of people in flight mode. And really, by being able to identify who was in flight, you could also kind of identify folks that might have a tendency to call in more during the pandemic due to the uncertain times, and adjust your staffing that way. So it was a good way kind of to monitor how people were feeling psychologically also throughout the pandemic, that correlated actually to attendance as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. The psychological aspect of this whole crisis, the amount of time that it's lasted, right? I think that's the impactful piece of the puzzle, that the uncertainty, and of course turning off the TV helps a little bit as well. But Mike and Michael, how about Mike? Why don't you give me your perspective? You're kind of on the other side of the country. Jenna's there in Ohio. Michael's in Connecticut. Mike, what about the western side of the country?
It was real interesting at the start of the pandemic, earlier in the year. One of the things that our organization did was really be proactive in the entire process. So they had all of us, we had to sit down and go through and put together what we called surge plans, and then look at staffing and resources. So in our surge plan, we took a look at resource sharing across the entire organization. So if we ended up with staffing shortages in one area, we could share staff in another area. The organization is still putting out documents twice a week in looking at our current patient census, what COVID's doing within the state, within our communities that where we serve and treat. And they actually put out guidance on PTO requests. So evaluate your PTO request, ensure that you've got appropriate staffing levels in case we do see a surge in hospitalizations. And then we didn't experience this in the HTM side, but throughout the organization, what we experienced because of the, they stopped elective surgical procedures, and we're only doing urgent procedures and preparing for that surge. We saw a number of caregivers throughout our organization that didn't have a job during that process, that elective surgery process, as well as our appointments going down in our outpatient facilities. So they actually redeployed a lot of those caregivers to areas of COVID testing, greeter and visitors coming into the facility. So they had them there. So they redeployed them in different areas, including into facilities management and environmental services. We had caregivers that were working in the OR that were actually painting walls in work that was being done in facilities that wasn't done before. And on the HTM side, what we saw during that process was actually the census in the hospital went down drastically, which allowed our equipment to be a little bit more available to our staff. And so we actually saw some of the workload go up in that aspect as well. So we weren't impacted from a furlough standpoint or a reduction in staff on the HTM side, but we did ensure that we were keeping them busy and sharing those resource planning and surge documents across the system.
Michael Heiser, before you answer, so you're just north of Ground Zero, really, one of the most affected areas of the country there in New York City. Michael is in Connecticut. Why don't you give us a little bit of your perspective as to what you were seeing at your facilities?
Yeah, so it hit us kind of fast. Pretty much as soon as New York started to get their spikes started, we opened our command center, and we didn't delay the closing of elective procedures until really closer to where the spikes started to hit us. So we tried to ride that all the way up to the end. And it worked out, but same as Mike said, they ended up furloughing a lot of clinical staff, repurposing the ones that were willing to come in and do other jobs. Furloughs didn't really affect our staff too much. We had some clinical-based requests to furlough our staff, so we did furlough a few people, well, a couple, I should say. We're a small staff of 6 technicians and 10 in total between clinical engineers and administrative assistants. So we converted a lot of the staff to pretty much remote that could be remote, and we converted our schedule to be a 6-day work week as opposed to 5 days, and split the team in 2. So we had 3 technicians on site for 12-hour days, 3 days out of the week, and then flipped. We made sure we had 1 ventilator guy on each shift because we only have 2 that are trained. And right before we got essentially crushed, where rooms were just basically full, we couldn't really travel amongst the floors. We pulled as many ventilators as we could. We pulled the inventory of what was going to generate in the next couple of months for ventilator PMs, anesthesia PMs, and we did everything that we could ahead of time, because if it got bad, we were planning on not touching those devices again unless a repair was needed, because it was probably going to be on a patient for either one particular patient or one after another. We hoped it never got to the point of 2 patients per ventilator, I should say. But it was a tough time, definitely, to say the least. And sick calls were a concern of, what happens if one ventilator guy got sick? It was where we're down to 1, and how do you manage the inventory? Nursing, transport, everyone here was extremely supportive of us as a whole because of us being a limited team. They were, We had closets set up with loaner equipment that we pre-organized, put every possible repair we could think of there. They were going to the closet, they were taking things, going and dropping off things that needed to be repaired, just to limit our staff's exposure to the units in general. And PMs were difficult to get. We got the ones that we could, like the areas where surgical was closed, easy enough to get. But if it was a monitor on a floor, you weren't seeing that from us. So
Yeah, that's a great perspective as to what you and your team was going through. And my next point was going to ask about the strategies that you've all employed to meet regulatory and compliance. You've all actually touched on it as we went through that first discussion point. Do you have anything more to add? We're going to get into some of the impact from outside vendors that come into our facilities, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But just from the in-house perspective and your planned maintenance or your corrective maintenance strategies, did any of you make any drastic changes? It sounded like you all flexed your staffing. Janet, you had mentioned about 16-hour work shifts, things like that. Would anybody care to expound upon some of the strategies that they use for planned and corrective maintenance?
So, Chris, this is Mike Bustiker again, and I think, you know, one of the things that we looked at, again, Intermountain started not too far down the road into the pandemic to reduce or eliminate elective surgeries, and we saw censuses in our hospitals that were prior to the pandemic that were running 80–90% census rates dropped to 25% census rates. So, you know, that huge decrease in patient census, as well as the appointments out at our outpatient clinics, really dropping off next to nothing as well. So what we did from an HTM perspective is we took a look at it, and we actually opened up our annual or any of our PMs that were annual or 18-month or 24-month PMs. We opened those up 30 days further in advance and actually redeployed or redirected our staff to complete those PMs, so that if we did see that surge, we had staffing shortages or resource problems, then those PMs were actually completed out a little bit, were 30 days further in advance than what they were going to be initially. So that really allowed us to stay ahead of that curve when it comes to the preventative maintenance and any of the corrective maintenance as well, and really plan ahead. And it worked out fantastic for us throughout our system.
You know, Mike, you brought up a point about census, and you know, I chuckle a little bit when I hear. I know sometimes I don't turn the TV off, although I probably need to do it more often. When I hear the news media report, you know, oh my gosh, the ICUs in Florida are operating at 80%, and I'm like, well, that's kind of normal. We really don't have, you know, a whole lot of vacant ICU beds under normal circumstances, because we do have those elective surgeries, and we are providing health care to people. What we didn't see are, you know, some of those elective cancer surgeries and things like that could be devastating to some of the patients. So as we get a little bit back to normal, yes, of course, we're going to see some of our ICU rates at our normal capacities, really. So Jenna or Michael, anything more to add on the strategies for planned or corrective?
I was just going to piggyback on that, you know, especially working, you know, our goal at the beginning of the pandemic was to work 3 months ahead on critical equipment. So looking at it through ventilators, ECMO machines, dialysis, infusion pumps, all of those things that were really going to be resource intensive for COVID patients, trying to work as much as possible 3 months in advance and get those PMs done. And our second shift team really was able to do a lot of that and a lot of that maintenance. So I think, you know, one of the other aspects to me, you know, for maintenance during COVID was transparency. One of the things that Kroppel did was created a new code in our CMMS to basically say, hey, this was impacted by COVID, so that we could track it and be extremely transparent, when Joint Commission rolled in, or just for the Environment and Care Committee. So for all intents and purposes, we absolutely, went for complete compliance with, the Joint Commission of the regulatory agencies. But we had this code and could really be transparent and say, these 10 things the vendor couldn't come in on, or we couldn't get in these rooms, and really having those open discussions about, what's the risk of this? Are we okay with this? And documenting that, anything that would fall under that CMS waiver when the regulatory agency came through.
And to add to that, for us, it was, we thought about doing a code, but we didn't have many things that weren't impacted, I guess is the best way to put it. Because it hit us so fast that we were able to pull the high risk things forward, get that was our focus, and then the preparation. A lot of the lower risk equipment was essentially not available. It just became not available, and it just happened nearly overnight. So a lot of what we did was we hit, finally after about a month and a half in, we hit almost like a lull. And we're still in it. Luckily, Connecticut is doing okay. But right now we're just taking advantage of it. We use, our EMR has a bed management tool that allows us access a HIPAA compliant version to basically see room availability. And we're leveraging that every second of the day. We're seeing which rooms are available, going up, get in the room. I don't even know if something's doing it. Just get in there and see if something is. Take advantage of it, and let's capture what we can. Just to either catch up on things that were mobile or out there that unfortunately got deferred just due to lack of availability, and catch up.
So that's a great segue into my next topic, and we've touched on it a little bit about outsource. So we all outsource some pieces of technology, more than likely, in our inventory. I know that we had a couple of vendors that at maybe in the May timeline, the end of April, May timeline, that said, hey, you know what, we're not coming in. We're not going to do that planned maintenance, that scheduled planned maintenance. So for those technologies that you might have outsourced in your program, how did it impact your facilities, and what was your strategy? Jenna, let's start off with you.
Sure. I would say, we had a few vendors, especially March, April, maybe beginning of May timeframe, when I think everyone was really trying to wrap their hands around it and understand where the hot spots were, that essentially said, we're not coming in, we're not putting our people in that type of risk to send them into a hospital environment. Also, the hospitals were trying to limit who was coming in if they were absolutely essential, also to mitigate that risk. So again, documenting those, working with the clinical folks and trying to make sure the right equipment was where it was at. I'll say bargaining with the vendors where it was really needed, that if we could ship something back, obviously in compliance with all of our cybersecurity requirements, or they could ship us a loaner in the interim. So I'd say, each vendor was a little different to work with and work through with that. And I would say the majority of them are kind of back on site, at least kind of late May, June. But one of the things that I think it definitely hit for me was, when push comes to shove in an emergency situation, our longstanding debate on right to repair, some of the vendors either didn't have capacity or weren't willing to put their staff in the same risk that we put, our frontline in-house staff there. And that's not meant to be a dig at the vendors. I think, everyone's doing their best to go their true north. But I think it will be interesting, once we're through the pandemic to a point. Obviously, I don't think we'll be through it, and it won't be a concern for quite a while. But one of the things that will be interesting is how this impacts the right to repair conversation. And now we have kind of this real world emergency situation where we saw, where there may be limitations and how that may frame those discussions moving forward.
Yeah, I was surprised too about the lack of PPE preparation for field staff by these organizations. They really had not prepared their teams with PPE. Mike Bustiker, you have anything to add?
Yes, I do, Chris. So thanks, and appreciate all of Jenna's comments as well. They were fantastic, and we did a lot of the same things here. What we early on in the process as well, what we did is when our organization came through and said, we want everybody to do surge plans, business continuity plans that are specific for the pandemic, and as we push forward, one of the things that we did was took a look at all of our major suppliers or major vendors that we had within our organization, whether it be on the service side or even on the parts side, our parts providers, and we said, you know, we want your business continuity plan. What is your business continuity plan? And a lot of them, you know, they sent us the standard national document that they're using, saying this is what our organization is doing from a national perspective. And we met with our local representatives, so that's not what we want. We want your business continuity plan from a local perspective. So if you run into staffing shortages or staffing issues, what are you going to do to overcome those? As well as meeting with them and saying, here are our facility standards as far as PPE goes, the entrances that you come in, here's the screening questions that you're going to be asked. And we expect your service personnel to comply with those local standards on PPE as well. So when we did get their business continuity plans, we could take a look at it and say, okay, you've covered this, this, and this, but what about this area here? So we did get all that information from them so that we had a plan going forward with our service providers from outside the organization, and as well as Jenna talked about the right to repair. You know, one of the things from a state perspective is we're looking at what are our lessons learned, what obstacles did we run into, what went well, and some of the things that we're looking at in coordinating with a state report is looking at is that right to repair piece and saying, you know what, we could have had some very serious issues with this. Luckily we didn't or haven't yet, but here's some issues that we could have had, and right to repair could take care of some of those issues if we're allowed or if we're provided the training and the service materials and things that we need as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about the right to repair that you've both brought up, and Michael will talk a little bit about Connecticut and their impetus on right to repair. But this is such an important topic that hopefully all of our peers are addressing with their leadership at their facilities, because it does need to. This isn't going to be the only pandemic. This isn't going to. This isn't going to end. We're kind of talking a little bit like we're out of the woods. I don't think we're out of the woods yet. I think we're managing it well. I think none of this, that the current spike that we see was unplanned. We have a little section of the country closer to our southern border that has seen a little bit of an increase in, well, not a little bit, a lot of increase in positive patients down there. And our teams are managing it superbly and doing very, very well with support throughout the nation, much like you've all discussed about how you utilize resources regionally and in our situation throughout the country to support those areas that have been spiking recently. But Michael, what about the Connecticut? Did the CMS waiver assist in any way for your strategies?
Well, it came out kind of late for us, so you know, we kind of anticipated it coming out there. You know, similar to what Jenna did with the code, we didn't necessarily code anything. We used what our standards are with available and unavailable equipment, and we were upfront and honest with it. And we started to pull the inventory forward from future months. So we looked at high risk to make sure we captured those, and anything that was radiology on that basically that non-exempt list from CMS, we started calling out to the vendors to identify what their stance was and what their capabilities were, and start getting letters from them. Either magically these requirements changed in their manuals that all of a sudden PMs didn't need to be done anymore, but we also just started documenting that and documenting everything that we could. And some of them were actually very good to work with, to the point where they were very flexible to come in and get it. Yes, the hospital didn't want to bring in people as much as possible to just the institution as a whole, but we expressed the necessity. We worked hand in hand with our command center, kept them involved in pretty much every decision that we were making, so that we weren't in a silo. And the benefits to that was we identified things like the CT. Those are being used extensively during COVID. Our portables were being used extensively. There's a lot more than just ventilator shortage. There was plenty of needs from a medical equipment standpoint that's ongoing even today. But the vendors were great to work with, where we had to take hard downtimes. They were right there with us in terms of flexibility of hours when they could do it. We were doing it sometimes late at night just to accommodate, to make sure that regular hours, if anything existed at that point, was accommodated for.
Yeah, I know one vendor comes to mind. It's a very large robotic manufacturer that is really the only game in town. And when they decided they didn't want to come into our facilities anymore, that was problematic. And I think a right to repair strategy moving forward would be beneficial to our patients and our facilities. So hopefully we continue to gain traction with regard to that, and make progress either with the FDA and CMS, so that we're able to service our equipment in-house, if that's the desired strategy we want to use. Talk to me a little bit, and I'll go with Michael Heiser, if you could help me with this talking point. And we touched a little bit on it. The emergency use authorizations, they were coming out fast and furious, and different types of technology. How engaged was your team into validating certain strategies, either through EUA type devices or anything else? One of the things that my team was involved with, we had sections of our buildings that we converted from typical standard patient floors to intensive care units. That required patient monitoring, networking, you name it. My team was jumping through hoops to try and provide that technology for the caregivers, so they had the tools at their fingertips for our patients. Michael, how about a little bit about what went on in your facilities?
So for us, because of our involvement with the command center, we were pretty much researching. We were the point people to look out for ECRI documents, AMI documents, anything coming from the manufacturers of the devices that we had or were renting, to just share with our clinical leaders and say, these are the capabilities, assisted in setting anything up that it was suggesting that could be done. The remote team that we had worked great. They worked feverishly, reaching out, sitting on hold, grabbing any manuals they could get, compiling that information, so that it wasn't just information overload for our clinical teams, but it was more of a synopsis, the Cliff Notes version of what they needed to know, and spell it out in a good presentation. We got creative. COVID hit so fast, the CCU unfortunately was full. We typically have telemetry in there. Well, those patients don't need telemetry, so we took those telepacks and moved them to an area that could better utilize them, and we stood up a tele unit basically within a couple of hours, where we already had the infrastructure in place, but we didn't have a monitor set up. We didn't have anything connected for the rooms. We adjusted sectors. We got it all up. So we were bringing different things to the table as much as we could, and keeping everyone informed.
Outstanding. Jenna, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think one of the things, especially at the beginning, is also working through all of the emergency use waivers, working with our legal teams and reviewing those, under what circumstances would we use an alternative ventilation, whether that would be multiple or whether that would be using an anesthesia machine, and what would safe use of that look like. So lots of walkthroughs with the clinical staff, as well as talking through what additional supplies and things like that we would need, and then really detailing out where that fit in the surge plan, and when we would absolutely have to use that. I think one of the things, we're really a growing and expanding organization. So because we're doing a lot of construction, we had a lot of equipment that was delivered and pending going in. So when COVID came, actually some of that was physiological monitoring equipment. And so we were actually able to use and retool some of that equipment that was going to be going in another project that was delayed due to COVID, and use that to create some of these surge floors. So really some of that capital planning ended up hitting at just the right time, and it made that surge planning for us much easier than it would have been had we not had that equipment that was waiting to go in. So in some ways it was good planning, in some ways it was luck, but lots of movement daily. And then I think as we look, we had surge plans for particularly the first phase. Now we have a different challenge. We have high census, high occupancy rates, and the potential of a second surge. Depending on what area you're in, you may be in that second surge. So the surge plans have kind of changed. So it's almost a bit of a different game, this second time around for many of the areas who may not have had that huge peak the first time, where it's kind of a modified surge. So one of the things we're doing now is our COVID surge is now included in our normal surge plans for high occupancy. So it's definitely interesting navigating that. So we have, the formal, this has become a red area and this is going to be a huge surge. And then we have kind of the middle ground surge plan, which aligns more with the hospital's regular surge plan. And when does that tipping point occur? So I think that's one of the things that we're looking towards now is how do we continuously refine and redefine these surge plans for the given needs?
Go ahead, Mike.
Yes, and Jenna made a lot of great points there, and some of the same things that we're doing here within Intermountain in our organization. So we have 24 hospitals throughout the state, and one of the things, is making sure that we're coordinating efforts at each hospital and we're all on the same page and doing the same thing. So the Incident Command Center had subcommittees, and one being the logistics subcommittee. And on that logistics side, we took a look at our equipment and what we thought our needs would be on a surge, from a surge perspective, and then looking at where we were going to stand up COVID units within certain facilities. Not all of the facilities would have those, but some of our larger facilities would have those COVID units that we wanted to stand up. So we looked at our capital planning throughout the year and said, okay, how many beds were we planning to buy this year? Let's roll them all together into one purchase. Let's buy them now, and then we put them into storage. And utilize them when we need them. And it was great because we had a couple of storage companies and moving companies out here in Utah that stepped up and said, you know what, we will allow you, you can store those beds here, we'll move them for you, and we'll do it at no cost as our part of the COVID surge piece. So we ordered, we bulk ordered beds, bulk ordered our ventilators, any pumps, feeding pumps and things like that we had coming in. So we bulk ordered that stuff, stored it, and positioned it for redeployment if necessary at our facilities. And again, Jenna and Michael, great points on a lot of this stuff. And you're right. I mean, as we started our elective surgeries back up again, what we've seen was our hospital censuses go from, from mild numbers to this morning, a conference call that I was on this morning, they said our ICU numbers were at 80% capacity, and not all of those are COVID patients. The majority of those are just standard patients that we treat within our facility. So you're right, we've got different surge plans now than what we've had in the past because we were anticipating that tremendous uptick in COVID patients, and we're not seeing that right now. And so we've got to take a different approach to it as well. And that includes, you know, I talked, I said earlier before the webinar started that we looked at all of our educational institutions, and we had a number of colleges that had ventilators within their programs, and they offered those as loaner devices. So we picked them up, brought them to our hospitals, but what we found is that we're picking up 10 ventilators, only 5 of them were functional. So we had to repair those other 5. So it's getting those into our inventory and system now, so that we're doing routine checks so that going forward, if we need them, we know that they're all operational. You're on mute, Chris.
Sorry about that. Yeah, we received some ventilators from our emergency management services teams, and gosh, they hadn't been looked at in 6 and 7 years. So that was something that our teams needed to do right out of the gate, was get those back. Mike from Multi Medical Systems mentioned about getting parts, and you know, some of these ventilators that are out there are older, and parts are more difficult to find, but we were successful in getting those back up to speed. The other thing I wanted to mention, in our situation, we're a little bit stressed. We have a pump manufacturer in our fleet that has been under recall for the last many months, and unfortunately, you know, the facilities, the third-party companies that sell used devices are now nearly depleted. There were lots of challenges. The rental companies, obviously, they don't want to sell. They used to be able to sell some of those excess volumes of infusion pumps they had. They weren't selling them because they could rent them and make more money. So it was quite a balancing act. But as we get near to the top of the hour, I do have a couple of questions, and I want to make sure that we're all engaged in maybe helping answer some of these questions. I do have a question from one of our viewers. We service several surgery centers that were closed, and now they are open, but we are behind on PMs based upon CMS guidelines. How are you managing this situation? Mike Busticker, why don't I throw that question your way? You have 4 facilities, and I'm sure a whole lot more different surgery centers and things like that that you manage. Why don't you give that one a shot?
So we, again, you know, early in the process, when we did stop the elective surgeries, and we had really a decline in the number of outpatient appointments, you know, one of the things that we did was work ahead in those processes, so we didn't run into that situation where, when those clinics reopened, those surgical centers reopened, that we were in the position that we were behind on those items. So we really worked ahead in that process. And some of the things that we found, I mean, I don't know, you know, how many if you have with the home healthcare piece, you know, we've got 30,000 devices in our home healthcare inventory, and engaging that staff in the process of ensuring that we're keeping up on the PMs, and having those devices coming in back into our facility, or whether the staff has got to go out to the homes, that posed a real problem too. And that's where we put together that plan, that surge process plan, and shared resources across the system. So you know, we focused on that shared resource and the ability of individuals to step outside of what they're currently doing to assist in other areas, to ensure that we're keeping on top of that stuff. It's, you know, it's an interesting thing, because now you look at it and say, well, we're behind on this. Can we just authorize overtime to do it? But when you start looking at that, now the organization's coming back and saying, you know what, 4 months of not doing, or 3 months of not doing elective surgeries, we're $400 million behind in revenue. So now we've got to look at how do we recover from that. So you've really got to get creative in ensuring that we're doing our part to help the organization recover, but yet ensuring that we're staying on top of the regulatory piece.
Yeah, you know, you bring up a good point. You know, the other issue is you had 30, 40 million people lose their jobs for either a brief amount of time, or they're still out of work at this point in time, 30+ million. So the healthcare, their healthcare coverage, and what has happened with that. So the revenue perspective is suffering from that, from those folks that are struggling to make ends meet as well. Anybody, Michael or Jenna, do you want to add to Mike's perspective on how to get?
Sure. I would just add briefly, I think what Mike touched upon is completely on point. When our surgery centers closed, it was not closed for maintenance. So we were able to actually get in, and have really full access to everything, as well as maintenance, getting paint updated and HVAC updated and all of those things. So if you're in that situation, my recommendation would be to flex your team, have someone work maybe an after hours shift, gain physical access, and just really knock them out. That's really the situation you're in. And hopefully you can get up to speed pretty quickly, and hopefully they're not doing surgeries, at 3 a.m. although they may be. But whenever you can get in and whenever you can flex time, that would definitely be my suggestion.
Yeah,
Thank you.
For us, we did what we could ahead of time. I'm not going to say we were 100% capable of pulling everything forward. We certainly have the scenarios where things open back up and we got to get in there. Money's tight. It's difficult to explain overtime or a late shift or working more hours. But it's also harder to explain taking a downtime. So, people are willing to listen if you express the differences, but then also your staff, some of them are very diligent. There's a lot of people out there that are in this together mentality and are willing to work that swing shift to go in those after hours, late times, and really help the budget out as well at the same time. So be honest.
Yeah. Speaking of budgets, I have another question from a viewer. Have you seen an impact to current or future products due to COVID-19? Absolutely. We have significantly been impacted on projects, and we're trying to work with vendors. We're building a new hospital, and obviously we're trying to work with not only the contractor building the hospital, but also the vendors that are going to be putting equipment into the hospital, trying to figure out how to reduce our costs associated with those projects. Anybody else have any project on the horizon?
Yeah, we've got a hospital that's under construction as well that was supposed to open in October of this year. That's been pushed back to April of 2021, and a lot of it has to do with the pandemic and the things that are going on. And yeah, there is a tremendous budget impact. And again, like I said at Intermountain, $400 million revenue shortfall, and that's not something that you're going to make up by increasing surgical cases between now and the end of the year, because you got your standard workload that's going forward. So the organization is looking at how can we recover from this, and we're asking, they're asking every single department throughout the entire healthcare system to contribute to that. So from an HTM perspective, we've got to look at it from the capital planning side, or the things that we can delay, and are there things that we can do with our suppliers or internally to help recover from that, from the pandemic cost.
Yeah, the CARES Act ain't going to make that up. Here's a great one for all of us. I wanted to get to this question before the top of the hour. How has COVID-19 impacted your ability to fill current open positions within your organizations? Goodness gracious, we were struggling with this prior to the pandemic. And then now that we're in the pandemic, I can speak from our perspective. It's been very, very difficult. Obviously, just interviewing people, just getting people, especially if you're, we're a nationwide healthcare provider, getting people to interview across the country or different locations in the country. You can't put somebody on an airplane, or at least back at the height you couldn't, but it's loosening up today, but it certainly has been impacted. Jenna, how about you?
I think so for my job market specifically, I was fortuitous enough to fill all of my vacancies right before the pandemic hit. So that was great, starting with a full house right before the pandemic, so that those, I couldn't lose those vacancies. So in many ways, what I've seen, at least anecdotally in the Southwestern Ohio job market, is that people are tending to stay and not be looking. So even some of those people you had thought might retire or you might not retain because different economic things have impacted them with their spouse or otherwise, are tending to stay. And actually recently we reopened a position that's been hard to fill for an imaging engineer, and we hadn't gotten anyone until this time around, and we did a in-person interview. It was the first in-person socially distanced interview we had done, and actually it turned out really well. Our clinical customers on the second round interview, we did do Zoom. They weren't quite comfortable with the in-person quite yet. So at least anecdotally, in the Southwest Ohio job market, I think Bmets and clinical engineers are tending to stay put a bit more, given the economic consequences, and also I would say the uncertainty probably with kids and school and all of those things until things shake out. And I'll consider myself lucky that at the end of the rainbow, I was able to fill one of my spots that had been really hard to recruit for. So I don't know necessarily if this will continue and people will continue to stay put a bit more in their jobs given everything that's going on. But again, anecdotally, that's what I've seen in the Southwest Ohio market.
And Chris, I would add to that and say the other thing that's going to impact the ability going forward as well is the disruption of educational institutions. The inability for students to go in to educational institutions and have to rely on online learning. I think that's going to impact us going forward. It may not be right now, but it will definitely be impactful going forward.
Yeah, great point. I got another question. Did any of you have one ventilator connected to multiple patients, and how did it work out? We did not. We getting stressed on our ventilators, but my team had validated every single model of ventilators that we own, that it could be done if we had to do it. And we also validated anesthesia machines as ventilators as well. So the HTM team did go through that validation process. Michael Heiser, how about you? Anything up there in Connecticut? Did it get that bad?
We validated in theory that it could work, but we made the decision that if it was getting to that point, we had many other problems on our hands, and we just honestly prayed that it didn't get there, and luckily it didn't, because it's not something we were fully comfortable with doing, just from a not only device perspective but a staffing perspective from RTs and anesthesiologists. It's just too difficult.
Here's an interesting question I'd like to hear from my panelists and peers. Did panelist organizations expand telemedicine to patient homes? How did they support remote monitoring via telemedical applications?
It's been a big push. It's been a big push. I think across the healthcare industry to move to telemedicine, and I know Intermountain saw a drastic uptick in what we call our Health Connect application, to where individuals can go online and be able to connect with clinical personnel to look at and talk about medical conditions. And we saw a huge increase in that. And then, so because we've been putting a focus on that, we had the ability to do, the remote monitoring and stuff in the past, and it was just actually ensuring that we were able to sustain the capacity that we were looking at going forward.
And we didn't experience the need for telemonitoring, if you would, but we certainly did advance with telemedicine and purchased, a platform for that to help drive at least seeing our patients that should be being seen.
So last talking point for my panelists, and then we'll finish up today's presentation. What are your thoughts on moving forward for the HTM industry and the COVID pandemic impacts on our business strategies? Jenna.
And I think COVID-19 really could be an ultimate disruptor to the healthcare environment as we know it. I think lots of things are going to be looked at in a recent ACHE webinar, really said, are you a survivor or are you a visionary? So, some organizations are just out there surviving because they weren't, financially poised before, and so they're getting hit particularly hard. And every organization's getting hit financially hard, but how are you doing that? So to be a visionary, one of their key enablers was technology. And so I think HTM professionals were really the go-to people to say, how do we solve this problem? So I think everything's on the table right now, taking a look at all of your costs and, with great urgency or great disruption, there's great opportunity. So I would say HTM, our job's going to be turning over every rock, looking at every way we can save money for our organizations, looking at every way we can use technology to reduce contact and reduce overall costs, and really ultimately provide the patient a better experience. So I think it's somewhat of a call to arms to say, hey, HTM, what do you have for us, and how can we use this moving forward in what healthcare landscape is going to look like in the coming years.
Mike Bustiger.
Thanks, Chris. And I think one of the things that we learned through this process, and one of the things that we need to do going forward is we really need to have more robust emergency management plans from the HTM perspective. I know we've looked at in the past, and when you do a hazard vulnerability analysis, you look at things like tornadoes or floods, or here in Utah, a month into the pandemic, we had an earthquake that we had to deal with on top of the pandemic. So, you look at those things, but really in the emergency management plans, how have we built or looked at our business continuity plans internally, our authorized service providers? We had a struggle with device usage, tracking real-time device usage, including our ventilators, without clinical support, as well as our CMMS, and molding those two together to be able to track that, and looking at storage of equipment for surge. So I think that the pandemic has presented a whole new opportunity to look at those emergency management plans, redevelop them, and ensure that we've got everything covered across the spectrum, not just what we're looking at from a hazard vulnerability analysis within our local geographic areas, but something that has impacted us now we look at from a worldwide perspective.
Yeah, I think you brought up a good point about utilization. We have tools today, the IoT, IOMT tools that sit on our networks for network connected devices, where we can garner information around utilization of those devices. That certainly came in handy in one section of the country. Michael Heiser, I'll let you finish us out and your comments on this topic.
Yeah, so Mike, you brought up a great point with storage. I mean, before pandemic, we were finding storage is the best way to put it. I think we're going to be given storage moving forward to help be prepared for things in the future. And I think now is the time where we're going to be really showing off our skills as just an industry of opportunities to save money and not spend frivolously on things that we really shouldn't be, maybe be a little bit more conservative going forward from a repair perspective, but even from a capital and a project perspective. I worked hand in hand with nursing, and they looked, to my opinion, from nursing to even the physician and clinical leadership to justify what projects we're going to move forward with, because we had a lot of projects before this, they got postponed, but all that money, can really look to be reallocated, whether it's to our regular expenditures now that are growing, or even just the need of COVID hit us fast. What did we learn? We get a second wave of this. What did we do that could have been a lot better for our patients, and make those purchases now and make it so that that's a sound investment moving forward. It's not just a COVID investment, but it's one that's going to benefit our patients and the institution afterwards.
Yeah, for any of those national disasters that Mike talked about. Well, Jenna, Michael, thank you so much for being part of this presentation. Fan information. Hopefully our listeners and viewers took away nuggets that they can apply to their program. Jamie, back to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. First, I want to give you, Jenna, Mike, and Michael a big thank you, not only for your time, but your perspective and the wisdom that you shared with us. The chats that were coming through from the attendees said by far one of the best hours that they have spent with Webinar Wednesday. So thank you so much for making this come to fruition. I do want to give just a couple of reminders before I let everyone go today. Another big thank you to our sponsor, Multi Medical Systems. Please visit their website, multimedicalsystems.com, learn more about this company, and reach out if it's a fit for you. Today's presentation was eligible for 1 CE credit from the ACI. In about an hour's time, you'll receive an email with today's post-webinar survey. Once you complete the survey, you'll receive your certificate. Should you have any questions, you can always reach us at webinars@mdpublishing.com. And don't forget to join us tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern for another live webinar. This one is titled A Collaborative Approach to Downtime Planning for Critical Medical Device Systems. If you haven't done so already, you can register for this webinar by visiting webinarweek.live. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. We'll see you right back tomorrow. Make it a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.